Welcome to my channel. My name is Adina. I'm an intuitive astrologer. In this video, we will be going through the birth charts, transits, annual perfections, and secondary progressions of serial killers. I started researching this about a year ago when I was looking at mental health in the birth chart, and I came across a few interesting things. So thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you align with my energy and enjoy my content. Now let's get right into it. I just want to throw a trigger warning out there that if you are sensitive to discussions about murder or sex crimes, please proceed with caution. However, we will only be discussing the characteristics of the serial killer and the energy surrounding the serial killer. We will not be getting into details about the events or the victims. And I also just want to throw a disclaimer out there that if you have similar indicators in your chart or know someone that does have similar indicators in the ones we will be discussing with these serial killers, please do not think that you or someone you know is a serial killer. It really goes a lot deeper. So I just wanted to really throw that out there and drive that home that yes, please do not go thinking that people are serial killers or that even you are anything like the people that we are discussing in this video. Now I'm going to invite you to protect your energy. This is something that I do when I am working with these kind of, lower vibrational topics or discussions. You can visualize yourself in a ball of white light, and please feel free to pause the video if needed. Now let's get into it. So we will be discussing infamous serial killers. We will be going over their birth charts, transits, progressions, and perfections. These are timing techniques that astrologers use to determine significant life events in one's life and significant years, which you'll get to understand kind of how that works through these demonstrations. I also love doing these demonstration videos and presentations because it allows you to get an idea of how energies can manifest and how to start to kind of put the pieces together for yourself and for others in your life. Now, I've listed here a few things I've noticed that are quite significant. So the eighth house rulers seem to be really significant when looking at these types of topics, where the fifth house rules a romance, pleasure, passion, sex. The eighth house also rules sex, but it can be more of a sadistic type of sex or darker themed sexual ventures, if you know what I mean. It's not that passionate romantic sex, it's the other type of sex. So hopefully you get what I'm talking about. And also the moon placement of the birth chart of the person, but also the moon, the transiting moon, right? And the moon is the luminary that transits the fastest. And that's what I really wanted to look at when looking at the transits of these individuals. Is there something significant taking place when they would commit the crimes? And also the Venus-Mars connection within the birth chart, I find, is also quite significant. And the Pluto-Mars connection, because Pluto represents power, control, obsessions. Mars is anger, aggression, and passion, but how you go about doing that. And then I've also thrown in Lilith and Ceres. These are asteroids. Lilith rules our innermost desires, and Ceres represents how we nurture and how we want to be nurtured. Now, if you notice any common aspects or indicators in the chart that I haven't mentioned in this video, please feel free to comment below. I want to hear. Now, our first serial killer is Ted Bundy. He was a serial killer who committed vicious sex crimes against women in the 1970s. Specifically, 1974 is when he committed most of his crimes. Now, he was born to a young mother out of wedlock. Her parents actually sent her away to have Ted Bundy to a home for pregnant girls, I believe. And then when she came back a couple months later with Ted Bundy, but his grandparents took him on as their own. So, and he was raised where he thought that where his mother was his sister. So he believed he had a sister and that was his sister, but in fact his sister was his mother. Now I'm going to pull up some progress charts which can show them around the age where maybe he found out that that wasn't the case. Now there was rumors of incest. His grandfather was believed to be his father, which a his grandfather was actually very abusive, but there was rumors where they thought that there may have been abuse towards the daughter and that his grandfather was his father. However, that was determined untrue through DNA testing later on in life. But his grandfather was a very angry and abusive man towards Ted's grandmother, and his grandmother suffered from severe depression and would not leave the house. Now, I'm stating that because this is actually something that's quite common with the people that we will be discussing is the relationship with the mother or maternal figure and depression. And again, I'm not saying that all mothers that are depressed are going to have children that grow up, but it is something that's common, which I find interesting. Now, he had no relationship with his biological father, but he did have a stepfather named John Bundy. And that's where that last name Bundy comes from. And also, as a young teen, Bundy developed an addiction to porn, which he has stated many times in his interviews that he believes that was a catalyst to his sadistic mind, where at a very young age, he started watching porn and he needed more and more and more, and it had to be more graphic. And then eventually he reached a point in his life where watching it was not enough and he had to act on it. So here is Ted Bundy's birth chart. So he was actually born under a solar eclipse in Sagittarius with a south node. I find that very interesting. The nodes are very faded, very karmic. And so I wonder if there's something that is very karmic about his whole life. Now, Pisces rules his 8th house. And to look at his chart, it would not look like there's a lot going on there. Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces. Jupiter is here in Scorpio. Now, Scorpio and the 8th house have very similar energies where we've got Jupiter in Scorpio, but Jupiter also not only rules that 8th house, but rules Sagittarius. And so all of this energy here in Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. And another interesting thing I find here is the mutual reception between Jupiter and Mars. Mutual reception is when these planets are in each other's sign. So Mars is in a Jupiter ruled sign, Jupiter is in a Mars ruled sign. This is called mutual reception, and this strengthens the energy of not only these areas of life, but also the energy of the planets and what the planets are doing in the birth chart. So we've got Jupiter here forming a square to Pluto in the 1st house. We also have Mars forming a trine to Pluto in the 1st house. We have the moon in Sagittarius, but with this conjunction to Mars and Lilith. This is something I find common in these charts is the moon either in Aries or connecting to Mars in some way, which you will see as we go through the charts. But we also have this opposition to Uranus, which can show one that does struggle with some internal emotional instability. This can even show up as anxiety, but this can show up as, energy that really does require balance throughout life. Oppositions are where there's these energies that are almost at odds with each other, and it does require this balance. Balance is really needed, but we also have this in conjunction to Venus retrograde in Scorpio and Uranus, and Venus retrograde can already determine one that can struggle with self-esteem, self-confidence. Being in Scorpio, this could be like this really deep mental psychological issue around self-esteem, self-confidence, his needs, his wants, his desires, and really struggling that on a mental and psychological emotional level. Now, another thing too is we have Ceres here opposing Saturn, which I thought was interesting. And so this could actually show that at a young age, he didn't really get a lot of nurturing. Like there wasn't a lot of nurturing going on, which then would affect his relationships because it is in the 7th house. Now let's get into, these are his childhood progressions. So around the age of 7, 1954, his ascendant shifted into Virgo and his Mercury stationed direct. So for those of you who are not aware of what progressions are, this is a year for a day method. And so an astrologer will usually, through an ephemeris print out 90 days or look at, the next 90 days of one's life to determine the next 90 years, and anything significant going on within those 90 days will show significant events that can happen and major life themes that one can go through and around what age. So we want to look at any planets that are either stationing retrograde or stationing direct. We want to look at when that ascendant shifts into the next sign, because that is going to give you another layer of energy and information about this person's being. And so for him, at the age of 7, his ascendant shifted into Virgo. Maybe this is around the time when he started to determine or started to figure out that his sister was his mother. I mean, we don't know. But either way, we know that at the age of 7, there was something very significant that took place. Because not only did his ascendant shift, but then the ruler of that ascendant stationed direct. And this could really show that there was an event that took place that changed who he was, because that ascendant is who it's you, your character, your personality, your physical body, who you are, how you view this physical reality, your perception on life. And so we know that that would have changed in some way. Now, at the age of 13 and 14, around 1960, he had a full moon in his progress chart. This is something we all experience. We will all have new and full moons, and it depends on how many you will have, depending on the phase of the moon at the time of your birth. But this again shows significant years and life events. Now, not only did he have that full moon, but he had Venus stationing direct. And I almost wonder if this was around the time when he started getting into that porn, because we do have, the moon with that north node, Uranus, the north node being very karmic, and the north node representing our life direction and the direction we are moving in this lifetime. That is really a part of our journey and our purpose, but it does show the direction that you're moving into. And you'll see this kind of show up as we get through the other charts. Now, here with the sun, there's Lilith and Mars. And so I feel like this is when something kind of snapped or clicked and he started getting into more of this sadistic, like watching more sadistic porn possibly, and that changing his mind a little bit and psyche. Now, this is his first victim, or his first documented victim. He was at the age 27, and he was in a 4th house perfection year. So a perfection year is through each stage of life, through each year. Every year on your birthday, another house is going to be perfected, and this means activated, where that house is activated and all of the energy in that house is activated. So for him, he was going through a 4th house perfection year, meaning that all of this energy here in the 4th house was activated. Jupiter, Venus, Mercury. So those planets through transit and transits to those planets are going to be more significant. Now, another thing I thought was interesting is this nodal reversal. And this is when something significant can take place in your life that changes your direction in some way that is very fated, very karmic. Now, of course, we all move through these differently, but it's very interesting that he almost started kind of this behavior and doing these things through his nodal reversal. And then another thing which I want you to keep your eye on is this moon connection to Jupiter. So here we have the moon conjunct Mars opposing this natal Jupiter at 13 degrees. He's also about to have Jupiter in his 8th house. And remember, Jupiter's the ruler of the 8th house. Jupiter's now activated. We have this moon opposition, which I find very interesting, and this nodal reversal. And so keep that in mind, because this becomes very prominent. Now, here's some more transits for his attacks. Again, here we have the moon connection to that Jupiter. Now we have Jupiter in the 8th house. Remember that Jupiter is the planet of expansion. And what is very interesting is that we can usually figure out how these energies are going to show up for us through transits a few weeks to a few months, depending on the planet, leading up to that point, meaning that it's very interesting that as Jupiter was about to enter that 8th house, he started doing this, which shows that transit of Jupiter in the 8th was really triggering something for him and really activating this behavior. And then this moon connection to Jupiter. Now watch the moon, right? And this is what I found quite fascinating was In the first one, we had the moon opposition. Here we have the moon conjunct that natal Jupiter. And the second one, we have the moon. And again, the time may not be exact. That moon could actually be in the 8th, but we also have Venus and Jupiter in the 8th. Venus and Jupiter are activated through progression or profections. Now, if we look at this one, again, this moon conjunction to Jupiter, we've got Jupiter still in the 8th. Now let's take a look at these ones. So this one is a little bit different. This one, we've got a moon conjunction to Uranus. I mean, the time could be off and that moon could be in the 4th house, but we have a Venus opposition and we still have that Jupiter in the 8th. We also have the sun on that north node. Now, if we take a look at here, we've got at this attack, we've got the moon in the 8th. Here, we've got the moon opposing Jupiter. So see how it's really interesting how that seems to be something that's quite significant is that moon transit. When the moon is either opposing Jupiter, conjunct Jupiter, or in that 8th house, he seemed to, attack. So, and that was my whole reason for looking into this. I wanted to see, is there something about the transiting moon and how it's activating the birth chart that has something to do with when they attack. Now, here we've got Jupiter retrograde. So let's keep that in mind. Let's move to the next slide. So, and he's still in a 4th house progression 4th house perfection because his birthday is November 24th. So it's not until we get to November 24th that he will move to a 5th house progression. And when he does, you see, it keeps mixing it up. It won't be till he gets to a 5th house perfection year that things start to change for him. But during that 4th house perfection year is when he commits most of his crimes and almost when it's activated for him to kind of start doing this in the first place. And so here we have, again, the moon opposing Jupiter. Here we have the moon now in the 7th. We've got this Jupiter retrograde still here too. And Jupiter is also trining his natal Jupiter. He's going through a Jupiter trine, a Jupiter in the 8th house. Now here there's a moon conjunction to Lilith. Here I find it interesting that the moon is right on top of his sun placement. And we've got that Jupiter retrograde still. And now let's take a look here. There's a moon opposition. Now, this one was actually right after a full moon in Taurus, which would have been not too far from that natal Jupiter. Here we have the moon opposing transiting Jupiter. He's also going through a Venus return. We've also got that sun on top of his natal Jupiter. And then here we've got another moon opposition to Jupiter. Now here is when he starts a 5th house perfection year. We've got a Venus conjunct the north node. What is interesting is that after this, there's actually only one other attack before he gets arrested. So I find that interesting that as soon as he entered that 5th house perfection year, things start to change for him. He has his first, he is arrested for the first time. Now he does commit more crimes after that, but through this 4th house perfection year, it seems like this is when it becomes very prominent for him. This is when he started, and it's not until that 5th house perfection year that he gets arrested and things start to change. Now, this is his confession. So when he sat down with the police and confessed everything that he had done, the chart on the left is his transits and the chart on the right is his secondary progressed chart. So the chart on the left I find very interesting because we have the moon in the 1st house conjunct Pluto. And also at this point, he's in a 9th house perfection year. Once we get to 1979 here, he's in a 9th house perfection year. And so that Aries is activated. We've got Mars up here, conjunct Chiron, which is very interesting. Now, remember that 10th house is his public image, public reputation, what you are known for out in the world. And we've got Mars up here. But what I find significantly interesting is this Mercury conjunction to the North Node. He's talking, Mercury rules communication, speaking, and he is confessing everything that he's done, which is going to determine his direction in this lifetime. I thought that was so fascinating, this Mercury conjunction to his North Node the day that he confessed. I thought that was very, very interesting. And he also has the moon transiting his first house, with the first house is you and all of that. So I thought that was very significant. And even the ruler of that eighth and the first, he was confessing about all of the sadistic things he did, everything he did to women. So I thought that was very, very interesting. Now, in his secondary progress chart, we've got a moon conjunction, a series. So I thought that was interesting. But also this Mercury opposition to Uranus, where again, he's communicating, he's talking about everything he did. That Uranus energy is going to be very shocking. Him telling people, and the T square to his ascendant. So him communicating and confessing everything that he did, changing his public image out in the world. So even through his secondary progress chart, there's this, and then even Jupiter at 19 degrees with the in conjunction. So it's really interesting. Now in his progressed chart, Mars is actually the ruler of that eighth house, and we've got this in conjunction to Saturn in the 12th of jail. Like the 12th house rules places that are hidden. So like asylums, retreat centers, being incarcerated, jails, prisons. So that's also quite fascinating. That energy there as well. Now, this is his execution. So this one was also very interesting. So again, on the left, we've got his transits. On the right, we have his secondary progress chart. So he has the North Node in the eighth house of death. And we have an opposition to the moon, which is the body, right? Your body. In this opposition, but what is very fascinating is that he's in his seventh house perfection year at this point. He's got Aquarius in the seventh house, ruled by Uranus. We have Uranus here forming a grand trine with Mars and the moon. So I thought that was very, very significant. And then the North Node being in the eighth house and the moon opposing that North Node in the eighth. So I thought that was really interesting. Now, in his secondary progress chart, we've got a Sun-Mars conjunction pretty much by the minute. I mean, here it's the minute, but the time's off a little bit. But I did that so that you could see, like, holy, like, wow. He, like, a Mars-Sun conjunction the day he's executed in his secondary progress chart. Like, how crazy is that? And he's also at that 29th degree of Virgo, almost ready to shift into a new, shift almost his identity and shift who he is. But we also have Venus now newly in Sagittarius. So again, very, very interesting. Okay, now let's get into our next serial killer, Paul Bernardo. He is a serial rapist that was in Ontario, Canada. This actually happened about 45 minutes from my hometown, and I was about 8 years old when this all took place, or younger. I think I was 8 when he got arrested. I remember this being on the news and the media and all of this. So this one hits very close to home for me. So Paul Bernardo was known as the Scarborough Rapist in Ontario, Canada. He committed multiple attacks, but he murdered 3 girls with his wife, Carla Homolka. We will be getting into her chart as well as their synastry and all that energy. And this was between 1987 and 1992. He was arrested in 1993. Now, he came from a wealthy family, but dysfunctional. His mother suffered from severe depression and would lock herself in the basement. Again, that's that mother and depression thing I was kind of talking about. The father was abusive and known to stalk and sexually abuse young girls, including his own daughter, which was Paul's sister. Now, in high school, Paul was known as the popular kid. And from what I've read, when they interviewed me, like past girlfriends, they said he was really polite, very thoughtful. But around the age of 16, something really significant happened, which I feel like snapped something within him. And I also want you to keep in mind that in the chart, in your birth chart, nothing can be activated that is not already present within the chart. This is called the natal promise. And so if there's energy already lying within the chart through activation, is how it's activated. And so we'll see that as we go on. But around the age of 16, Bernardo found out that his mother had an affair and that the man that had raised him and that he thought was his father was not his biological father. His mother called him a bastard in the middle of an argument. And after that, he changed. His demeanor towards women changed. He had no respect for his mother. He would call her names and became very verbally abusive towards her and abusive towards women in general. And he actually took joy in publicly humiliating women and developed more of this just this aggressive behavior. Now, this is his birth chart. So he has his moon in Aries in the 8th house. We've got this moon Venus conjunction, which is actually ruled by the moon, which is in the 8th house. The moon rules Cancer, and he's got Mars and Venus conjunct in Cancer. And so his Mars and Venus are ruled by the moon, which is in the 8th house. And there's also this mutual reception between the moon and Mars ruling Aries, the moon ruling Cancer. So there's this mutual reception between Mars and the moon being in his 8th house. So I thought that was interesting. He also has this first house stellium, which it does not indicate, I don't think is significant when we're looking at these types of behaviors. There's a lot of people that have first house stelliums. But what I find interesting is that Chiron placement. And Chiron, your Chiron placement represents a wound, a trauma, a vulnerability, or where you have shame for something that has happened in your life, or where you developed shame through an experience. And I find it interesting that his is at 17 degrees in 1 minute. And I learned from a couple of my astrology teachers that actually the degree point of your Chiron placement can indicate around the age that something happens that changes who you are in some way, whether it's something you become, whether it's some type of trauma that happens, or where you hold a lot of shame through an experience that has happened. But I find it interesting that his is at that 17 degrees in the 7th house, which what happened with his mother was at 16, and it changed how he was towards women, which changed his relationships and that whole 7th house kind of energy. And then the opposition to his chart ruler, Mercury retrograde, is his chart ruler conjunct Pluto. And so I thought that was really fascinating how that kind of showed up there. Now, we also have this Mercury sextile to Neptune, which is interesting. And then this Neptune kind of trine Venus and Mars in the 11th. So there's also this like grand trine happening. So the activation of that Chiron placement was really going to change. And you see how it's like this energy that's already within the chart. It's like when that happened, it really activated something within him. This grand trine almost got activated. So it's really interesting. And then of course Mars in that 8th, right? Because Mars rules that energy here. Now we also have Lilith here in the 5th that we just want to, take a look at. Keep in mind, the 5th house rules our hobbies, our interests, what we do for fun, what we're passionate about. And not all of us are going to have healthy interests and hobbies. For him, his are not very healthy, right? Or positive. His are more sadistic. And we've got this out of sign kind of trine with Lilith and the moon, but also the sextile to Saturn. And even this trine too to his sun. This almost like this grand trine kind of taking place here as well between Lilith, the sun, and the moon. We also have Jupiter trine the ascendant. Now, this would be a positive aspect, right? Jupiter is in Taurus. Taurus is ruled by Venus. Venus is ruled by the moon in the 8th house. So for him, it's a little different, but I want you to just keep these placements in mind because through transit, they seem to be significant. Now, these are his childhood progressions. Around the age of 6, 1970, his ascendant shifted into Libra. So something happened around this. And he has actually a lot of childhood progressions. that change. I did not add them all in here because there was a lot of them. But I did add these ones because these ones I think are probably more significant than the other ones. But we've got a Mercury-Uranus conjunction in the 12th. I almost would not be surprised if there was some type of sexual abuse or something going on in his childhood, but there's definitely something significant around the age of 6 that probably changed him in some way. And also the around age 10, 1974, he had a new moon in his chart conjunct Pluto, and it's in that 12th house. So I think that could also probably be significant and something probably really happened, that was quite powerful towards him and who he is and all of that around that age. Now, this is the first attack. To be honest, I would not be surprised if this was not his first attack, because if we look here, he's age 22. He's in an 11th house perfection year. So this energy here in the 11th house is all activated. Cancer, the moon, because the moon rules Cancer, and then also that Venus and Mars. We've got Lilith here on the 11th. And so this is the first documented attack. But what I find fascinating is this North Node in the 8th house. And I wouldn't be surprised if once Jupiter entered that 8th, and again, it's Jupiter in the 8th. That's the same as Ted Bundy. This Jupiter transiting the 8th house, activating whatever that energy is within that 8th house. I wouldn't be surprised if he was thinking about this for a long time. Once that North Node entered the 8th, that urge became more powerful. And then as soon as Jupiter entered, it was like it overcame him and he had to act on it. I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what happened. So, I would say his first attack was probably back when Jupiter first entered, or even just before Jupiter entered the 8th, but we don't know for sure. But the first documented attack, he's got this Venus Jupiter conjunction here with the North Node. And it's interesting that when this started to happen, that North Node is in the 8th house. Now, with Paul Bernardo's transits, they're not as cut and dry, I find, as Ted Bundy, where there always seemed to be this connection between the moon and Jupiter. I didn't really notice that with Paul Bernardo. So we'll see how these things play out. And again, if you see something I don't, comment below. But so here we've got, that energy in the 8th. We've got this moon square to his natal moon. We've got Mars in that 10th house on top of, with Chiron, which is kind of interesting with that conjunction there. And also the same house as his North Node. Now let's move to the next slide here. So here's a couple of his other attacks. So here we've got Venus still in the 8th, conjunct his natal moon. He's still in an 11th house perfection year at this time. We've got the moon, though, down here opposing his chart ruler, but we've got the moon in Jupiter's house, which is interesting. The moon being in Sagittarius, Jupiter ruling Sagittarius, and Jupiter being in that 8th house. Here's the second one here. This is just before his lunar return. We've got that Jupiter on top of the moon. So Jupiter does seem to be pretty significant through the first few attacks. Even here, what we've got, he's going to have his Venus return here. Now, once we get to the 4th attack, he's in a new perfected year. Now he's in a 12th house perfected year. We've got Lilith in the 12th, and here we've got Lilith in the 11th. So, we've got the North Node still in the 8th. We've got this Jupiter retrograde on top of his moon. Now, the 4th attack was different because he broke into someone's home. So we took it a step further. I believe this is the first one where he actually went into somebody's house. So I wanted to see, was there something different? And I noticed that there was that Jupiter retrograde, which stationed, right on top of that. Well, I don't actually know if it's stationed on top. It may have got to 28 degrees and moved back. I didn't check, so I don't want to state that. But the Jupiter retrograde being on top of his natal moon, I think, is significant. Now, if we move to the 5th attack, this is when things start to get a little kind of sticky for him. This is when the police issue a warning after this 5th attack. We've still got Jupiter in the 8th house. Here we've got this moon opposition. So that's interesting. we've got here Jupiter still in the eighth. Um, and this one is when he was now known as the Scarborough Rapist. Now, of course, people didn't know he was the Scarborough Rapist, but there was like a title to the person committing these crimes on the news and on the media, where there wasn't social media back then. But on the news and like the newspapers and stuff, there was now a title for him. There was a name. So, which is interesting because this is his chart ruler, Mercury, and there's a Mercury Cazimi taking place here, which would be him, his identity changing in some way. However, with the Neptune, nobody knew it was him. There's this, illusion and kind of hidden element, and it's also on top of his natal. It's in that fifth house and on top of that natal Lilith. So that's interesting. We also have a moon conjunction to Venus. Now, when I was looking, I did notice there is a lot of connections between the moon and Venus when he does commit these crimes. Like here he's got this moon square to Venus. Here there's a moon conjunction to Venus. But then here, there's the sun and Mercury kind of in his eighth house on top of his moon. The moon is closer to Jupiter. Oh, and I also want to state too that these are not the exact times. The exact times are not listed. So we don't know exactly the time this happened, but this is a rough estimate. And the moon moves about a degree every couple of hours. But it could have been a little bit later than this, and that moon could be closer to Jupiter. But I did notice that there is a connection to the moon and Venus through his transits. Now, this is when, with this eighth attack, this is when he was spotted by an officer. So again, I wanted to see with something different. We do have Venus retrograding in that 11th house where he's having a Venus return, but Venus stationed retrograde. So I don't believe he was actually able to attack. I believe this is when he was hiding under a tree. He was ready to attack and he got spotted by an officer. So I wanted to see was something showing up in his chart to prevent him from doing what he was doing. He did have this moon conjunction to the south node, but we also have this Mars conjunction to his Saturn. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. And also the sextile with Saturn, like transiting Saturn retrograde. And his Saturn retrograde, there's the sextile, and then with that Mars energy, and then with the Venus retrograde. Now, with the 10th attack, this one became a lot more violent. When I did the research and kind of looked into them all, this one was a lot more violent. So I wanted to see what was going on in his chart that would maybe make him be more aggressive or more violent. And this Mars retrograde in his eighth. So I thought that was really interesting. He's also going through this Mars square. So that kind of stuck out to me a little bit with this Mars retrograde in the eighth. Mars being the ruler of his moon, right? And Mercury retrograde opposing his moon. And Venus is also transiting his 12th too. Now, actually, I wanted to also mention that between the fourth attack and the fifth attack is when he meets Carla Homolka. And this is actually when the North Node enters his seventh house of relationships. He meets Carla Homolka. So I wanted to also mention that. Now, here is Carla Homolka. So this is the girl, his wife, that he committed some of these crimes with. So I don't believe she was a part of the attacks. However, I do believe that he eventually started to tell her what he was doing, and she was all for it. She was very, kind of had the same behavior as him. And let's take a look. So she's got this Venus-Mars conjunction. They also both have, so on the left, this is her birth chart, but on the right, this is their synastry chart. So they have their moons, both in Aries, almost conjunct, which is fascinating. They both have a Venus-Mars conjunction. They also, what is really interesting too, I felt, was this Lilith Sun conjunction. So her Lilith is conjunct his sun. Her ascendant is conjunct his Lilith. Now, Lilith is your innermost desires. So, those internal that sometimes that not everybody sees, but those parts of you that are not instincts, but I guess the proper word would just be those inner desires, what you like to do, what you want, what you desire. And the fact that they have that trine but also conjunct here, I thought was interesting because they both have, those same types of desires and sadistic behavior. And the moon both being ruled by Aries, almost conjunct. Now let's go now, and also too, her north node is in his seventh house. So there is this karmic connection, but the south node almost like conjunct that Uranus, where it's this very different, this is going to be different. Oh, also too, this Pluto conjunction to the ascendant, I thought was interesting because this can be a power couple when you have Pluto conjunct your sun, moon, ascendant. This can enhance this is literally the placement of a power couple. Now, is it good power? Is it bad power? It's, you know what I mean? That is where it gets a little sticky, but it's where one feeds off of the other. You can feel each other's energy, and this strengthens almost that power within to do certain things. Now, for them, it could be this obsession, right, towards these desires of this Lilith, Sun, Ascendant, right? Could be definitely play out in that way. Now, this is the transits for both Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka for their first murder, which their first murder was her sister. She was 14 years old. Now, what I find interesting with this is we've got a Mars retrograde, Mars on top of his Jupiter. There's the moon in his seventh house, something he did with his partner. And we've also got all of this energy taking place in his fifth house and this Mercury Cazimi, Mercury retrograde. There's this Lilith and Uranus conjunction. This is all in his fifth house. But for Carla, what I really thought was fascinating with this is, yes, she's got all this energy moving through her first house, but she's got the moon transiting her third house of siblings, the moon being ruled by Jupiter, right? Or Jupiter ruling Pisces, the moon being in Pisces, Jupiter retrograde being in that eighth house of death. So I thought that was very interesting how that kind of showed up, was this moon in Pisces in her third house of siblings and the ruler of that in the eighth house of death. And then we've got this whole behemoth of a transit in her first, which is really crazy, and his fifth, which is like his hobbies, his interests, what he does for fun. And he did this sadistic crap for fun. It's, now here is their second murder, which by this point, Paul is age 26. He's in a third house perfection year. Carla is age 21. She is in a 10th house perfection year. And so for Paul, this energy here is activated, but also Mars and Pluto, because Mars and Pluto rule Scorpio. And for Carla, that ninth house, Carla, the 10th house is activated here. And so this energy is, the Uranus is activated, Jupiter, and then also Venus, because Venus rules Libra. And so her having that 10th house activation would activate Venus, transiting Venus, and also transits to her natal Venus. And so let's take a look at the transits here. Now, again, this is not the accurate time, so we don't know exactly where the moon is or the ascendant, but it is interesting that the ascendant is here in the eighth, but also interesting that we're coming up to this like moon conjunction of Venus, but there's this Mars Jupiter conjunction, Mars ruling that third house, that is perfected for Paul. So I thought that was kind of interesting there. And for her, there's this, it's all on the 8th. So that is another thing too, is that it's always in the 8th or the 12th for them, which I find fascinating. Her 8th is 12th. The 8th house can have to do with those deep desires, that kind of sadistic behavior. But then the 12th is also, things that are hidden, things that you're hiding. And also, kind of those self-undoing or self-sabotaging behaviors. Now, this is their marriage. The interesting thing about their marriage is that while they were getting married, the body of the young girl that they had just murdered a few days prior, which was that second murder, was being found. So I wanted to take a look and see, is there something going on with Neptune where it can show there's something hidden? Well, we do have this Uranus, Lilith, Neptune conjunction here, again, in his fifth and her first. But what I find fascinating about the day that they got married is that there is a Venus Mars conjunction. It almost makes me wonder if they used astrology. They both have a Venus Mars conjunction in their birth charts and then got married the day that there was a Venus Mars conjunction. So it makes me wonder if they followed astrology. But again, it's in the 12th and the 8th house, which I find interesting. We've got Jupiter there. There's this Moon Saturn conjunction, which is something that would be great when you are getting married. Saturn represents commitments. And so that's also kind of fascinating that there's a Moon Saturn conjunction. But also too, Carla has the South Node transiting that 7th too of relationships. And the North Node moving through the first. And this could really be changing who she is as a person. Not necessarily that she was a great person before, but there's something about this relationship and something about this transit, I think, that was going to change her. So now let's get into murder 3. Murder 3, by this point, Paul is age 27. He's in a 4th house perfection year. So Sagittarius and Jupiter are activated here and the nodes, and he is getting ready to have a nodal reversal. And I don't know if they murdered after this. It's possible. There's nothing documented or nothing that is known of. But this is almost when it changes after this, especially once we get to the end of 1992, and they're arrested not even a year later. And he's about to have his nodal reversal. So it's almost like once he starts his nodal reversal, things really change for him. Now, there's Venus in that 8th house. We've got this huge behemoth of a transit, Uranus, Neptune, which to live through this isn't something that not everyone's going to live through. A Venus or a Uranus, Neptune in her, well, there's also that North Node on top of her ascendant, but Uranus, Neptune conjunction is going to be almost like a once in a lifetime. Unless you were, well, we were born, I was born at this time, but I was young. But it's not something that it's a once in a lifetime transit. So that's kind of crazy that this is going on and that it happened right on that conjunction, and that it's in her 1st house, it's in his 5th house. We've got the North Node on top of his Lilith. We've got the North Node on top of her ascendant. And this is actually this would have actually been on a full moon in Libra on top of his natal moon at 27 degrees. Because the time is off, right? So if we move ahead a couple hours, this is all happened during a full moon. That moon is at 21 degrees. A couple hours later, by the time we get into nighttime, that moon is at that full moon state, which is right on top of his natal moon. And this is apparently the last murder that he did. This is when things started to become very rocky within their marriage. I mean, I'm sure he was very abusive to her through the whole thing, but this is where she went to the police. There was pictures taken. She's got 2 black eyes. He beat her with a flashlight. And my whole reason for putting these charts up is because I wanted to show you how this kind of showed up in their charts through transit. So for him, we've got Mars retrograde. He's going through a Mars return, Mars retrograde, pretty much on top of his natal Mars and Venus. We've also got this Moon Venus conjunction, and we've got Lilith moving through his 7th house. Now, for her is where I find it gets really interesting, because she's got that Mars retrograde in her 7th house of relationships. And there's this in conjunction too with the Moon and Venus, and also and also this kind of square to her natal moon and the moon ruling that seventh house of relationships. So not only does she have Mars retrograde in the seventh house, but she's got Mars retrograde in the seventh house, squaring her natal moon, the ruler of her seventh. So this would show something, really powerful happening within our relationships. And this is where he beat her with a flashlight. And then there's this in conjunction to Mercury and the south node and the north node, which I find interesting because this incident is what really led to her talking to people and telling people what was going on and to their arrest with that north node in the 12th house of jail, prisons, asylums, like all of those places that are hidden. And that is where she was heading with that north node in the 12th. She was going to jail. And her talking, right? That Mercury is what was going to put them there. But that also, and look, there's like this yod. There's a yod here. Mars in conjunct North Node and Mercury, sextile Moon and Venus. And so this is what activated and triggered her to talk, which put them both in jail. And so I find that really fascinating. And again, this is where she talks. She goes to the police. This is February 9th, 1993. So for him, he's got this Mercury in the seventh. And I find it interesting because his wife is talking, that kind of Mercury energy, conjunct his Saturn. But there's also this Sun Saturn conjunction too. And he's still going through that kind of Mars retrograde in the 11th. For her, she's still got that Mars retrograde in the 7th. There's the Sun conjunction, and then we've got this Neptune Uranus conjunction still in the 1st and in the 5th. He's got that Venus in the 8th. She's got the moon on top of Uranus, so that's interesting. Opposing Venus. There's this moon Venus kind of opposition here. So that's interesting. And this was going to change her public image too with that Jupiter in the 10th. And she's going through her Jupiter return. So she was going through her Jupiter return and that North Node, and her public image was about to change for sure. And even the Mercury here, the talking, changing that life direction. So really interesting. Now, this is Bernardo's arrest. So February 17th, 1993, he was arrested. We still got that Mercury in the 7th house, Venus in the 8th. At this point, Mars has station direct and the ascendant, and he's going through his nodal reversal. So that was the big thing that kind of stuck out to me. And we've got that Neptune Uranus conjunction still happening. But the thing that really stood out to me was the transits of, the moon is kind of conjunct because we don't have the exact time. But again, the moon is conjunct that Neptune Uranus, which is interesting. The ruler of this being in Capricorn is Saturn in the 7th, which had to do with his wife talking, right? That's that Mercury energy. We've also got Venus in the 8th, and then he's going through his nodal reversal. So we would know this is going to be a significant time period for him having that nodal reversal. So I thought that was interesting as well. Okay, now let's move on to Jeffrey Dahmer. So this is our last serial killer that we will be looking at. I think we've looked at enough for one day. But Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer who took the lives of 17 young men, possibly more, between the years of 1978 and 1991. Now, as a child, he developed a fascination with bones and dead animals, corpses. He would collect dead bodies of animals and skulls and large insects, and just developed this kind of obsession with like dead things and animals and corpses and stuff. Now, at the age of 4, he suffered a traumatic and painful recovery after hernia surgery, and this was said to have changed him. at the age of 8 years old. And I'm kind of putting these ages in here because he has quite a lot of childhood progressions. And so then you're kind of able to match the ages with the progressed charts to see how certain things can manifest. But at the age of 8, his father says he was molested by a neighbor, but I don't think that Jeffrey Dahmer ever admitted this. And this is something I just came across in an interview that I watched with his father. But his father did mention there was something with a neighbor around the age of 8, but I don't think Jeffrey Dahmer ever admitted that. Now, around the age of 14, he did develop an addiction to alcohol. He started drinking a lot more. And I think that this is when he started getting into porn and dead animals and putting the two together and this fascination with necrophilia and all of that. And then at the age of 18 is when he started to fantasize about sadistic behaviors. Now, here is his birth chart. So he is another one that has his moon in Aries, which I said is quite common with these charts, I noticed. We also have this moon Mars conjunction in Aries. So that's quite a powerful Mars, especially with that moon. There's also a moon trine to Uranus, which is interesting. And he has quite a few yods as well. There's this yod here with Saturn and Lilith and Uranus. So that is fascinating, right? Lilith ruling those desires and that deep internal kind of. Lilith can also rule like the black sheep energy. It's what is different. It's what you can. Lilith energy is hard because it's hard to describe because a lot of people will. Or if you look up energy of Lilith, you'll always say Lilith is the energy of like a whore, kind of, and excuse my words, but that's almost how a lot of people will, and it's not necessarily that energy, but it can be this seductive energy. It can be these deep desires, right? And so that's why Lilith, I think, becomes a lot more prominent too in these types of charts. But yeah, there is this yod with Lilith and Uranus, Saturn, and there's also an in conjunction too with this Mercury and Neptune. So he does have quite a lot of in conjunctions, and Jupiter and the Sun. In conjunctions can be very difficult. Also Neptune and Mars are in this in conjunction, this very strong Mars forming this in conjunction to Neptune in Scorpio. Neptune retrograde, so that energy becomes a lot more internalized, right? And in conjunction are hard. They have to be worked through consciously. And they are usually very psychological, I've noticed just through my own research. And I have in conjunctions in my chart, and they really do have to be worked through consciously. It's where these energies, there's nothing in common here, and they're very hard to see. I almost feel like you can't even actively work on this part of yourself or become aware of it without knowing your birth chart, to be quite honest, because this is energy that you're not aware of, that's kind of deep inside, that can be really deeply psychological. And you almost have to become aware of your birth chart to become aware of these parts of yourself that need to heal or that you need to work consciously on, in a sense. Now, we also have a very strong Venus in the 8th house because Venus is in Taurus and Venus rules Taurus. So this is a great placement for Venus. It is in his 8th house, but we've got Mars in his home sign, Venus in her home sign. There is this kind of Venus square to Uranus. And there is this opposition with the moon and his ascendant, which is interesting, where there's something at odds here with who he is and what he feels he is or feels he should be, or what he's feeling inside, that internal urge, those instincts, and then who he is. I mean, this could even be some form of a double life in a sense, depending on other energies into with that trine to Uranus. I mean, there's definitely a lot of issues here when it has to do with his habits, his instincts, and he did struggle from alcohol addiction. There's a lot of addictions here. There's a lot of obsessive behaviors here. And so that could definitely show, especially too with this in conjunction, I think, with the Uranus and Saturn. I mean, I think that could definitely show struggles with some type of obsessive behavior, especially with that trine to the moon. Now, here's some of his childhood progressions. I did put a lot for him. He does have a lot. So, around the age of 3, we've got Venus entering Gemini here. Around the age of 12, we have his ascendant shifting into Scorpio. So, that energy now becomes in his first house. And remember, your birth chart, it's always your birth chart. But what your progress chart does is gives you another layer of information, another layer of energy. So, you could dig a little bit deeper to see what's going on there. We've got this kind of Mercury moving closer to Lilith. If we move around the age of 14, we've got a Jupiter Lilith opposition, which is interesting here. And then at the age of 15, he had a full moon, also with the sun in the 8th with Venus. We've also got Lilith in the 8th. There is kind of to the sextile with Mars. But this would show a very significant age or period of time where something does definitely change. And because it is, with that 8th house, and there's also this yod still too. I mean, Venus is moving off of that yod, but there is that energy as well. Here's more of his secondary progressions. This one was for 1987. I wanted to throw these in because this is when the sun enters Cancer. And this one here in 88, the following year, Venus enters Cancer. So I thought that was really interesting because this is around the time where he does become more active, where he starts to commit more murders and all of that. And so I wanted to throw these in there. And then here we've got Lilith entering Cancer. So it's almost like that, those desires, it strengthens. And then in 1990, we have a new moon in Cancer conjunct that Venus, that Lilith. So I wanted to throw these in here because I thought that just this whole thing was quite interesting, how we've got that Venus entering Cancer, the sun entering Cancer, then that new moon in Cancer, and it really happens all within a short period of time, within a few years. Now, this is his first attack, which happened at age 18 in 1978. He was in his 7th house perfection year, so that Mars and the sun, the Mars and the moon were activated in Aries. What I find fascinating is that this is at the end of the South Node transiting his 7th. And I almost wonder if these desires became so strong. And right before he's about to have his very first nodal return, he commits this crime. And it's this, and also too, he's never admitted that he was gay. He never admitted his sexuality, his preference. But I think it became very strong and obsessive for him, compulsive. And then he finally acted on it. And it's fascinating that it was right before he started his nodal return and in a 7th house perfection year. Now we also have this Jupiter Lilith conjunction square Pluto right here in that 10th house in the first. So that's very interesting. And then this Mars kind of conjunction to Pluto, which is interesting. And then the moon opposite that Venus in the 8th house. Now, if we move to the second attack, it's almost 10 years later. However, I just watched an interview and he talks about there was a murder actually that happened in 1984, but I couldn't find any information other than him stating it in an interview. So I don't have any information on that, but the second documented attack was age 27. He's having a 4th house perfection year. So all of this energy here in the 4th house is activated. And we've got this Saturn Venus conjunction. This is also during a new moon in Scorpio, opposing that natal Venus in the 8th house. That's interesting. We've also got Jupiter on top of his natal moon. And again, if you look, those nodes are almost in the exact same spot as the first attack. So where he committed his first attack, just entering his nodal return, now it's again during that nodal reversal. I thought that was really interesting. And now this is his third attack. He's 27, still in that fourth house perfection year. That nodal reversal is now more prominent. And we have a moon in conjunction to Venus and a moon trying to Jupiter. We've got this moon kind of conjunct. Yeah, see, the moon is like forming this in conjunction to Venus. And we've got Venus in Pisces, which is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter in his seventh house on top of his natal moon. So that's quite fascinating. And then this kind of moon trine to Jupiter. And remember that Jupiter is activated through perfections. Now, this one is March 24th, age 27. He's still in a fourth house perfection year, but this is shortly before he actually turns 28. But I believe it's quite a significant time period between the fourth and the fifth attack, but we'll get into that. We've got Jupiter now in that eighth house. He's having a Venus return. We've got the moon kind of up here in the 10th, but there's this moon opposition here. And this might not be the accurate time because I don't have the times either. So yeah, keep that in mind. I don't have the accurate times for these ones. So the moon could actually be in Cancer, be opposing that Jupiter. We've got Uranus in here as well in that fourth. And he's also going through a Saturn return too. So again, kind of interesting in that Lilith and that Uranus, but there is this moon opposition to Jupiter, Venus and Jupiter in the eighth. So that is significant just because that Jupiter is activated. Jupiter's in the eighth, and this is something similar that we've seen with Ted Bundy and even Jupiter in the eighth with Paul Bernardo. So see how there is these kind of common indicators. Now, this is the fifth attack. So this one, is it the fifth or the fourth? Yeah, see, the fifth is almost exactly. It's 1 year later, the fifth attack. So at this point, he's age 28. He's in a fifth house perfection year. He's going through his Saturn return, his nodal reversal. We have a Moon-Pluto conjunction, which is opposing that Venus in the seventh. Or Venus in the eighth. And then we have like this sun. Venus is getting ready to have her Venus Cazimi, where there's this rebirth, but it's right on top of his natal Mars. So that's interesting. And there's this Jupiter-Mars conjunction too, on top of all this energy in the ninth. Now, these are some of his transits. So by the time we get to May 20th, he's 28. He is still in that fifth house perfection year. But this is when things become a lot more consistent, like the age 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31. Those are the ages that he becomes a lot more consistent. There's not a lot of larger periods where the first one there was like a year, or the first one there was like 18 years, wasn't there? There was quite a bit of time, or 10 years, I guess 10 years, because it was this, I was thinking a nodal return, but no, it was about 10 years because he had his nodal return and the nodal reversal. And so this is when things really pick up for him and become a lot more consistent. So March 20th, he is still in that 28th year where he's in a fifth house perfection. We've got the North Node in that fifth house now. We've got the Sun and Mercury up here in the eighth, kind of conjunct that Venus. We've got Venus here conjunct the moon, and the moon in Aries, like he's about to have his lunar return, but this energy is interesting. And the Sun kind of being in the eighth, but he is going through his Saturn return. And this is something kind of consistent, and it does seem to really pick up. However, once we get to those last few transits, it's like it's happening almost every day. Now in the second one, he's going through his Venus return. We also have a Mercury return. We still have Jupiter up here in the 10th house, which is interesting because Jupiter being in Cancer Cancer ruled by the moon. We've got this, and his moon being in Aries, where he's got this Mars return going on. The moon being actually in Pisces, ruled by Jupiter. Very interesting. And here we've got this Mercury retrograde. So with Jeffrey Dahmer, I didn't notice as much consistencies with the transits where there's not like one transit that activated something. I mean, there's interesting transits going on, but it's not like the moon is hitting a specific spot every time he's acting or attacking or, murdering or whatever the case is. There's interesting things going on, like planetary returns. Here's a Venus return, a Mars return, but it's not, I didn't notice any consistency with the moon placement or the moon activating certain parts of its chart. Now, I may be missing something. If I am, comment below. Like here, we've got a moon opposite Pluto, moon conjunction to Mars. Here we've got the moon kind of in this opposition to Uranus, Venus conjunction to Uranus. If I'm missing something, comment below. But I don't notice a lot of consistencies with the moon transits. Now, here we have, by the time we get to that September 4th, he's in so September 24th, 1990, he's 29, he's in, is he 29? Well, he's actually, he's 29. Well, no, he is 30 at this point. So he's in a 7th house perfected year. Oh, right. This is once he reaches that 7th house perfected year, which is here, because his birthday, this one's right out before his birthday. But once we get to this one here, this date, he's now 30. He's now in a new perfected year. So he's now in a 7th house perfection year. And this is when things really seem to kind of pick up. Now, we've got the 7th house perfection year that Mars, Moon, and Aries are activated. But again, here we have a Mars opposition to a moon opposition to Mars, moon conjunct Lilith. We do have this energy kind of in the 12th. We've got that Venus conjunct the North Node, which is interesting. Here we have a lunar return in the 7th. But again, nothing that really sticks out that's consistent, right? Here we have, this is right before he turns 31. A Venus return. We've got the moon down here. He's no longer in his Saturn return either after we kind of move on. And there's quite a bit of a gap here between these two attacks. But let's move to the next. So the next is May 24th, 1991. So by this point, he is 31 years old. So he's in an 8th house perfection year. This is the one where I thought this is when it really started to pick up. I thought it was the 7th house, but it's not. Once we get to that 8th house perfection year, it really picks up, like May 24th, May 27th, June 30th. So I thought that was really interesting that he's in this kind of 8th house perfection year, and these deep kind of sadistic, obsessive, compulsive desires overcome him, and he just can't help himself. He just starts to commit more. He starts to attack more, right? And it's becoming more of a daily thing for him. Now he's going through a moon opposition here. This one, we've got the moon opposing natal Venus. This one, we kind of got the moon squaring that natal Venus. We've also got this Venus square happening with Mars on top of that Uranus with Jupiter. So that's interesting. Jupiter's also kind of squaring this energy too, which is kind of interesting. Now, hold on. This is, because there's June 30th, June 5th, June 15th, June 19th. So it really picks up here. Here's a lunar return. There's this kind of Mars trine. We still got Jupiter with that Mars and Venus energy. Then Mars and Venus enter his 12th house, which we've got the moon in the 12th here. And then same with here. There's this Mars, Venus on top of this Pluto. But like, I don't notice. I mean, a couple of them there are, I guess, with the moon. These ones are not. I mean, the moon is in the 12th, which I think is kind of a new transit for him to attack. But again, we don't have the exact time. But it does seem a lot more sporadic, but more consistent once he has that eighth house perfected year. Now, this is when he was captured and he had attacked a man. The man escaped and chased the police officer down, brought the police officers back to the apartment. And that is when they became aware of what he was doing. He was arrested and everything kind of ended for him. So this is when he was arrested. We've got that moon kind of in this third house, and again he's still in that eighth house perfected year because it's been only months, right? But there is this in conjunction with the moon and Venus, but I wanted to see, was there anything that kind of showed up? I mean, we have like the ascendant on Mars. This one is more of a specific time because there was a time for this. So that's interesting that the ascendant is on his natal Mars in the seventh house. This one, there is a time. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. We've got Jupiter on top of that Uranus, which the Uranus is squaring his Venus, but also a part of that energy too, remember? So that's also quite interesting. And now this was his death. So he died very suddenly. He was attacked in jail. He was murdered in jail. And we have this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. We've got the moon in his first, and this is the time where he was found. But we don't know exactly the time where he died, but this is the time when he was found at 8:10 a.m. But what I find fascinating is the south node in the eighth house of death, and then the north node kind of in Scorpio with Venus, Mercury, and then this Mercury, Jupiter, Pluto conjunction, I thought was kind of fascinating. And then that south node, and then there's this square too from Mars, and then Mars kind of being on top of his natal Uranus. But those are all the energies that that I kind of picked up, but I hope that you all get something from this presentation. It is interesting to see how these energies can manifest, how certain things can show up in the chart, where sometimes there seems to be common indicators, sometimes not. Sometimes there's these, even common activations too. Like for Ted Bundy, it was very consistent that when the moon was connecting to Jupiter, it seemed to be when he would attack, where for Jeffrey Dahmer, it was a lot more sporadic. But once he had that eighth house perfection year, things became more consistent. So it's kind of interesting to see how these energies can manifest. Now, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I will be making many more of these types of presentations, but not on serial killers. We'll do some more happier people. But anyways, thank you so much for joining me, and I will connect with you all in the next one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you align with my energy and enjoy my content, and I will connect with you all in the next one.